they hear me. Good. Okay. So, hello. We have just finished UK Thrones War this weekend, and there was a draft, there were stats, and we're gonna see if we were correct in our predictions, how the draft went, why we were wrong, or maybe we were right sometimes. Possibly not, probably not, no.
With us here today are...
Sure. Me, Buzz. You, Trey, maybe? And Wamma, of course. All three of us are spreadsheet nerds, deluxe.
Welcome to Spreadsheet Nerds.
So you will basically just see a bunch of spreadsheets and us nerding out over them. Welcome. Trey?
Good to be here. I'm the only person here who was not actually at the tournament, so I'm not sure I have anything of value to say.
You're also, to be fair, the only one of us who was taking part in the draft, despite not attending the event.
Oh, I guess that's right. Buzz, you were running...
I was mostly streaming and talking to you guys a little bit, but I wasn't
right.
actually
I did
drafting.
take over Sandy's auction for, I think, like the last 6 picks because he had a meeting to go to, and he had life priorities. So I think we're really missing having a Roy Rogers here today. You know, having a host. Nobody really wants to be Roy. But so the general idea of what we're going to try to do today is just talk about, spreadsheet stuff, nerd stuff, of like the numbers behind the format. I think Buzz had the idea of like, let's take a look at UK Thrones War at the end with an eye towards like giving people more information going forward. So that when we have more of these kind of events, especially because like they're wonderful, they're very successful, we want to do more of them, and if they are more competitive, that's going to be a better experience for everyone involved. And so the idea today is maybe we kind of take you under the hood a little bit about the numbers behind the Thrones War format, if that makes sense. Cool. James is also somebody who's done some of this work. He took a look at some of my spreadsheets before and then did some better actual math about them, I thought.
I don't know about better actual math, but I will take the compliment gleefully and greedily nonetheless.
I guess, yeah. What I would say is like, actually, I want to actually start this conversation by saying I want to open this conversation up to people who are actually interested in the math also, because I feel like I've taken a few like basic steps of stuff that I've stolen from like rotisserie baseball, and I could actually feel like we could use help applying better mathematics to what we're doing here. And so I'm kind of like specifically, calling out to like Mira or people from the community that actually know something about math and data analysis and maybe applying it to what we're doing here today. So I know I would personally love to hear from more people once we kind of get into what we're actually talking about here. Okay, so let's just start off. Buzz is showing a spreadsheet here, and I think what we're calling this here is like the generic pre-draft. And this is what I would put together before any draft happens. And this could be improved, but essentially what I'm trying to do is get a list, like punch in what are the actual specifications of a given auction. How many players are there going to be? And the idea is we want to get to, how much money do we have to spend? How many wins are available that the players are going to be competing over? And so what you're seeing there is for UK Thrones War, given that there was 12 players per team, a regent and 11 slots. Is that right?
Yep.
Guys?
Yep.
That means that by the rules of Thrones War, each team will have $120 to spend between buying one house and the 11 player slots, $10 per slot. is the rule. And so the total budget would be $960. The reason why you see 951 here is actually I've kind of gone and tweaked this at the end of the draft, because we actually had some money that didn't get spent in the draft, but this should be 960.
And just to apologize to the British listeners and viewers, when Trey says dollars, in this case, he of course means pounds sterling. But I expect you'll keep saying dollars, so consider them interchangeable for the time being, as they probably will be as currencies before long anyway.
I hope no one needed that that explanation, but maybe. Okay, I'm sorry.
Needed no, wanted yes, probably.
Got it. So, I'm sorry for my American bias.
So how many auction wins are up for auction? How do we calculate that?
Okay, well, right now the rules are a little bit different between different war events, and maybe that's something that will stop happening as we go forward. But one of the advantages of this kind of format is we know exactly how many wins we're competing over. So this was 12 players per team. You're going to play 7 rounds, which means you are going to have 336 wins in the Swiss. Mm-hmm. Like we know that exactly. We also know that depending on the specific rules of the tournament, we knew that the format in this tournament was going to be you're going to count wins in the cut, but we're not going to include the play-in wins. Mm. I think that this will be different for Thrones-Toberfest with Roy, in which they're going to count the play-in round, and if you get a bye during that round, that's another win. That's another point. So generally in these kind of tournaments with this kind of size, that would mean there would be 31 wins to allocate in the cut rather than 15. Using the kind of X-2 advances format that I think we've kind of settled on as a community.
Sure.
All right. So what are we doing here? The core idea behind Thrones War auctioning is you are buying wins. Like, this is a very Moneyball idea, right? How's the best way to spend your money in order to buy wins? And so that's what this whole spreadsheet is about. And we can kind of get to very quickly what does a win cost. And so I think if you look at H13 or whatever there, given all the math here we can figure out that a win is generally going to cost you $2.55 or £2. And would that be pence, James? How would you? Okay.
Pence or hundredths of a pound, whichever you find rolls off the tongue easier.
So that's the general in the world of this particular tournament. That's what it's going to take to buy a win. So if you had $120 or pounds,
you can say dollars. It's fine.
Jeez, this is going to kill me. I mean, 120 divided by 2.55, that's going to give you your average number of wins, right? And then how well per team, and then how well your team does is going to, be plus or minus off of that average. So here's some of the questions to consider when trying to figure out what to pay for players and what to pay for houses. First off, you need to divide your budget between what are we paying for players versus what are we paying for houses. So it's helpful to think about this in terms of like, what is the overall budget that all of the regents are going to spend on house. We can look at this particular tournament, and I think it ended up being about 14.5% was spent on house. 14.93. Again, I've kind of gone in and retroactively punched in some of the numbers here. All of the houses added together added up to 142 this time, which meant that 809 was left over for the players that could be bought in auction. So there's nothing that says that 15% is kind of like the right number. I personally think this number should probably be higher, but that's what Regents actually spent. It's kind of generally been in the 10 to 15% range. I think Thronstoberfest actually went up closer to around 18 or 19, which is probably a good trend. Even though that's a weird one, right? Because the restricted list is coming out tomorrow, I believe. And I think we're generally expecting to see a compression in the disparity between the power of the houses. So maybe one way to think about this is like the larger the disparity between the houses, the larger the budget for house should be, if that makes sense.
The weakest house is always going to be worth £1 or $1. And therefore, how much the strongest house should be worth depends on how many more wins than the 8th best house you're expecting the best house to get you. If you're thinking about each win being worth, $2.50, £2.50. If you think by default having the best house is going to get you 12 more wins, then it would be worth, £31 in that case. If you think it's only going to get you 5 more wins, then it'd be worth like £13 or £14, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So what do we do with this? We know that one win costs $2.50 or pounds, and what? So what?
Okay, well, it's a good starting point for what you should be willing to pay for a win. And so, as James was saying, if you're looking at the spread of your houses, and this is something a regent should do, is you should go through the thought experiment of not just ranking the houses in terms of I think Greyjoy is the best right now, and maybe Lannister is the worst. I think it's important to actually put a number on how much better you think that is. What is an average house? And so, hypothetically, if you said, okay, well, Greyjoy is going to contribute 12 more wins to my 12-player team compared to Lannister, then your spread is probably something like 35-1. 35 on the high end and 1 on the lower. I think what we'll see from this tournament is that spread was probably much, much larger than that. And that's maybe a reason why regents should be spending more on the top houses. But it's also the case that the more you spend on house, the less you have to spend on players. But just something to think about when it comes down to, there's a meta call to make, which we do all the time in Game of Thrones, not just in terms of what decks are going to be dominating, but there's a meta call to be made in terms of how much a regent's going to spend on house, and you're going to want to try to guess that so that you make sure that I'm paying the right amount for players based upon what I expect people to pay for house.
Sure.
Let's move on.
Yeah. In column F, we see that you have a suggested bid. How
I
is
get
this
there?
done? Yeah.
Okay. So first off, it would be a mistake to take that number, the 2.55 per win, and say, okay, I'm going to pay $2.55 per win for each player. You do not want to spend $5 for a 2-win player. The idea here is replacement value, right? What can you get for a buck is very important, and you don't want to pay for what you don't have to pay for. And so kind of a core idea of building the spreadsheet here is the idea of what do you get for $1? And my answer to this right now, especially given the Swiss style tournament format that we run, is that what you get for $1 is 2 wins. The very nature of the tournament is going to make it pretty hard for a player to get less than 2 wins. It's going to happen, but I don't think you would take anybody who's in a Thrones War player pool and predict less than 2 wins for them. Sure. It's more like you would view that player and say, the worst player we have, I can still pretty much pencil in 2 wins, plus or minus 1 for their performance there. And you don't need to pay more than $1 for that. So The implications of that are that you essentially take 2 wins out of the equation for every single player that you're going to be trying to predict value for. The two wins are given. That takes a lot of wins out of the system. It takes a lot of money out of the system. So once you've taken 2 wins out for every single player, then you get to this figure, the wins minus 2 figure, which is 5.84 essentially, of like, this is what we're actually paying per player win above and beyond 2. I think that the term for this would be like the marginal value here. What are you paying for every win above 2? So that's how we end up getting to kind of like column E here. Is if you're expecting somebody to give you 6.2 wins, and that's like my highest ranked player, that should be worth about 24.5 in terms of what they're worth there. Now, the suggested bid is more me kind of just trying to smooth out the curve and not doing a very good job of it by the looks of how this got sorted. Because there's a little bit also of like maybe it's helpful to know what these values are, but it's not so helpful if it means, hey, you can never get if it comes back with something that's not going to actually return results that, like, you're not going to be able to get anybody at these prices, then that may not be completely helpful. So I think it does make sense. Maybe what you're seeing in the suggested bid here is I may be tweaking the top players a little bit and assigning some extra money there, because that's probably a good thing to do anyway, because there's going to be kind of a lot of easy profits at the bottom of the draft anyway. It's also the case that the best players are the most predictable from a performance standpoint. So like the higher you go up on this chart, I would say that your money becomes safer, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Harder to make profit, but you know what you're getting usually, right?
That's right. So right, being safer means you should be willing to pay more for it. Whereas, right, and that, maybe, and that's, is there something at the bottom of the range too, where like when you're paying $1 for a person, you don't have a lot to lose with them there. It's awful when a $1 player gets you 0. We had no players in this tournament that gave you 0. When they give you 1, it's bad, but the downside was pretty limited there, right?
Yeah.
It's probably worth quickly at this point, obviously, offering up the caveat that when we're talking about players in terms of wins, obviously a player, we know, we're humans, we know a player is worth more than the number of wins they give. But it's a lot easier to talk about the cold hard stats of each player in a vacuum rather than taking into account, how many wins they're helping your other teammates get, or helping, just have a nice environment to have a team with. You can't put those values in a spreadsheet so easily.
Yeah. And we needed to put it in a spreadsheet to do the perfect draft. But also, as we said, we won't find value up in the top. We will find value at the bottom. So most of the drafts will be decided by these $1 players and who picks who, etc. Anyway, Trey has done
That's certainly where you have the most profit potential at the bottom.
Yeah,
right.
And we will get to that later. So we have all this in mind. A win is worth 2.55, but more what we should pay for it is probably 5.9, 5.8. Trey has done this for me and others a few times, and I helped out Sandy together with Trey to put together a list. So basically what we did, we took Trey's list here. We knew what each rank of player should be worth. And I took stats from Jousting Pavilion and ranked them. So Jousting Pavilion for UK Thrones War says Ryan Wood is the best, Hanno Lunzer is the second, James Wamma is third, etc. going down. This means that we can put trace values into this And so you'll see we should probably pay around £27 for Ryan. We should probably pay 26 for Hano, and going down, etc. Now, we also took notes, which I have hidden for good reason. And then we start doing some subjective stuff. I did more subjective stuff for Team Targ at War Prime this year because I had more time. But there are some stuff. So in the notes, I will, for example, note down who is a drinker, who will show up drunk to the tournament. Okay, let's avoid those if you can. Who is active online? We want people who are active in chats. So even though Ryan is the best, I know that he might not be the most involved player, but someone like Walker or Mira will be. So they might be worth more. I also, actually, this is new for this time, is I ranked international players higher than UK players. Because I think that people put more effort in if you're traveling. So you travel to the tournament, you want to do well, so you practice more. There's a more of a commitment, so you commit more time to practicing. Then we made stats over house preferences for everyone. So we knew that even though we have Tyrell here, me and Sandy drafted, Isian has noted that Tyrell is not one of his favorite factions, so we will avoid him. I noted down what kind of playstyle they have from what they're playing on Justin Pavilion, so that we could have an even spread or not draft 5 aggro players that we might not be able to give decks to in Tyrell. And then there was room for tweaking the rankings. We didn't do this, as you can see, it's 0 everywhere. But if you think that Ryan Wood is the worst player in the world, you enter minus... Let's see. Oh, I'm not logged in. I can't edit. But you could... you can write minus 3,000 and he will go to the bottom. And that's basically what we did. So during the draft, we would more or less just nominate or bid on the top player every time until we got who we wanted.
Which may not be the right thing to do. It
Sure.
might have been the right thing for where you were in the draft, but...
Sure, yeah. There's a lot more going on and a lot more thought to it, but more or less, you try and draft the highest value player for the lowest amount of money all the time.
Buzz, could I make a quick request?
Yes.
I don't know if you know how far down that list George Anchors is, but he wants to know whether his Jousting Pavilion style is referenced as ew.
It's varied, I wrote.
Varied. Okay, that's a very good euphemistic word. I like it.
He also has Greyjoy as a good faction to have, and none of the factions are bad for him. It's what we did for him.
So James, did you do something like this too?
I didn't sort of do player evaluation because I sort of nominally I had a couple of the regents sort of asking for my opinion on stuff, but I wasn't sort of on a pre-draft team, so I put more of my effort into looking at the factions because it felt, in the first place, it felt easier to do, and
it may be a more important question too.
Yeah, I mean, I think both are important to large extent. Obviously, according to the amount that players and teams went for, teams were 15% of the budget and players 85%. I don't think it's that big a disparity, certainly, but certainly the faction side of things is easier to do. So that's what I focused on.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. This is specifically what I don't do, though. Like, I really don't have any thoughts about who's a good player or not. And I think this is really interesting. You know, you're kind of building a mathematical model here, Buzz, for determining player value. But that's definitely not what I'm doing. It's more like I'm trying to build the distribution curve, you know, of wins. They're going to happen in the tournament, and then any regent can come up with their list. Like, as long as you rank your players from 1 all the way down to 100 or whatever the, you know, final thing is, you can then kind of like apply them to the curve, and you have a good starting point for what a player should be worth based upon where they fall on that curve. And like, one of the things I'm interested in is kind of like building a better curve as we move forward, a more mathematically based curve. Whereas like right now, I feel like I'm hand waving the curve a lot.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Interestingly, in the chat, Jack Machin has noted that Targ did this exact thing basically, but with a lot more personal biases.
Yeah, I talked to Wedge
Which is fine,
briefly. I don't think they did exactly the Trey thing, but more or less they had a bell curve and player rankings, which is more or less what this is doing.
Well, if you look at the Targaryen draft or auction, you will notice that they spent a maximum of $21 for any player, right? So they may have embraced the idea that no player is worth more than $25.
Yeah.
And that should certainly be one of the takeaways from maybe the spreadsheet, is that, or this is something I would tell new regions, it's like, I think it's okay to pay more than $25 for a player. But when you are doing that, you are no longer buying wins. You're no longer just buying your wins. You are saying this player is going to be valuable to my team in other ways. It's going to go beyond their statistical contribution. And this could change based upon the player count a little bit here. But James, you went for 35 in this?
Stupid amount. Yeah.
Pretty sure this was 35, yeah.
Right. So that's going to be almost an impossible number for a player to reach. I think the winning player, the top 2 players probably end up earning that at the end.
I mean, I think
that's what it would take. You know?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit, but I think we ended up having 1 player worth that amount. We had 2 players who were worth about 35 or more. One of those was a regent who couldn't be drafted. So, yeah, it was a risky play to spend that much.
Yeah. Okay. Do we want to...
Yeah, what do you want to do next here, Bez?
Maybe go to the Thrones War stuff, actually, like the actual evaluation. Now,
okay.
We've said what you usually do before, and what I usually do before, and how we merge them. And then now we can look at the drafts. What happened, what actually happened.
Right, and trying to make sense of it.
If possible.
What are, if possible, good point. So, do you want to throw up the actual final results there, and then we can maybe start talking house value?
Sure. Just tell me when to go to the next thing.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so, congratulations to Team Targaryen. This was pretty surprising in that I didn't predict this. James didn't predict it. I think there's a very good reason that Targaryen won, and it has a lot to do with getting that house for $3. I think there's probably a decent amount of credit that belongs to player evaluation and their approach to player evaluation. But I think if the number one explanation of what happened in UK Thrones War is, kind of this head scratcher of, how did Targaryen go for $3? How did the meta change, or the perception of the meta changing so radically devalue Targaryen going into this auction. Buzz, do you want to talk about like what Sandy was thinking and what you guys were thinking going into this?
Yeah. So let's see if I have the rankings somewhere here. This sheet will be a lot more messy, but
oh yeah, that's good in the upper right there.
yeah. So going into the draft, me and Sandy put out a Google form which asked a number of players what are the best factions right now, rank them from 1 to 8. So what we came up with was Greyjoy was clearly the best house, then Stark and Night's Watch was close seconds, and then we had Tyrell, which this I think Tyrell in 4th might have been me nudging it up a little bit for the war format specifically. And then we had Baratheon at 5th. I think they had been doing well after the box released, but the stats maybe wasn't there to back it up, and we were probably wrong at putting them on 5th. It probably should be lower. We had Martell pretty high still, and Targaryen at 7th, which was the big thing. We did not believe in Targaryen. We were gunning for getting to Greyjoy, and forcing it to 45, which we didn't.
Right.
Then we really wanted Night's Watch, but stepped out when it went too high for us. And then we lucked out and got a good profit in our view on Tyrell. But we really did not see Targaryen as a house to go for at all. We even made sure to not enforce price on it. We couldn't because it was one of the last 3 that went. But we wouldn't have either because we didn't believe in the house at all.
So this may have been a mistake, but it was a mistake that 7 other regents kind of made, right?
Sure, yeah.
In that, I mean, for Targaryen to go for 3 meant that everybody had an incredibly low opinion of Targaryen, or else they just couldn't bid on Targaryen at that point because they had already purchased a house.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like one of the interesting things about the format is like you can only have the one house. So when you buy a house, you lose your ability to price and force the other ones. And there's some positives and negatives to getting a house early, and maybe we can talk about that later. But it might try to remind me, I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday. Did it get down to like the last 3 houses were Targ, Bera, and Lannister? Was that?
Yeah, that's correct. It's the 3 regents, Martin, Wedge, and Josh, who were all like sort of like drafting with the expectation that they'd be getting Lannister for 1.
Yeah.
And then when it became apparent that 3 of them were drafting with that same expectation, adjustments had to be made, which was Martin had to go above 1 to get Lannister. Wedge saw the writing on the wall and tactically switched to Targaryen as their opinion the best of the 3 remaining factions, and Josh was stuck with Baratheon.
I remember because I think Buzz was Tyrell the 4th last to go, and I remember being very relieved when you guys got Tyrell for 10, because like as you get closer to the end, they're typically, and it's happened in a lot of these drafts recently, there becomes the kind of death match to avoid the worst house.
Yeah.
And it just kind of happened that in this particular event, I think we had a number of regents that were actually okay with getting Lannister at $1, so there was no reason to kind of bid up the second worst or third worst faction in order to avoid the worst faction. But that's happened. We've seen that happen a number of times. So I felt like you were lucky to get Tyrell at 10, and then Targaryen going for 3 kind of was especially strange because it showed that not a surrender, but whoever got Lannister for, or what, Lanny and Bera both went for 2, which was also a little bit weird. It just shows that they were content to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was really their or also that they did not want to play Targaryen. Like a lot of times people make decisions just based upon the kind of game they want to play, as opposed to like what the actual value might be.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say both Josh and Martin didn't want to play Targaryen. I mean, Josh didn't want to play Baratheon and still ended up with it, but I think neither of them wanted to play Targaryen. And it's interesting you mentioned about how often in drafts, those sort of the last couple of factions, other than the bottom one, get price enforced up. Is you mentioned previously how Thrones Toberfest, the factions went for a greater proportion of the budget. And I think that's a large part of why, is that I believe, I'm doing this from memory rather than having the figures in front of me, but I believe the penultimate faction to go went for like $30 and that pushed up the price. Whereas in this case, because we had 3 different regents who were fine with, I mean, I say fine with whichever faction they want. They all actually wanted Lannister, but they were fine just getting a faction for essentially nothing. That dragged the price back down again after the initial prices of Greyjoy Stark and Night's Watch all sort of set the values of factions quite high. It just then wasn't subsequently price enforced because of the strategies of the regents.
Yeah. Right. I mean, we can talk about that a little bit later, but it's also like, I think we're just doing a little bit of a post-mortem of like, how the hell did Targ go for 3?
Yeah.
And a lot of things I think had to line up for that to happen. And that ends up kind of being the story of the entire event because there was so much profit there.
Yeah.
Not only is this 6, I mean, 6 is wrong. 3 is especially wrong. And a correct price for Targaryen is probably somewhere in the 20s. So like that's a tremendous amount of profit that will then convert into wins. Like that in itself could, translate to 7 or 8 wins just right there before you even get into player choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing we were talking about in terms of this, like the deathmatch thing at the bottom, is often the problem with getting a house like Lannister or Bera for $1, is that it's going to happen often pretty late in the draft, certainly compared to the other houses. That's going to happen late. And I think what we also see is that once you end up with like Lannister at $1, you're now past the point in the draft where you can spend the rest of your money in a productive way. You didn't build your team around, I'm going to get Lannister often. You probably have a lot of money sitting around and you're looking at your draft board and the top 25 players have already gone. So you now have too much money to spend on, bottom half players. And that's not a formula for getting a lot of value. You can't, you'll spend it as best you can, but you almost can't spend enough money you can't buy enough wins. There's not enough wins left in the player pool at that point to make up for the deficiency that you created for yourself.
Yeah, I think often you have to sort of telegraph your strategy by spending the money on players in advance and then just not having much money left by the time it gets down to the last faction.
Wouldn't it be smart to just nominate Lannister for 1? Boom.
No.
Why?
Terrible.
Because then whatever the 7th best faction is now becomes the $1, £1 faction.
Fair
and
enough.
Whichever regent gets that gets a strictly better deal than you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would take it even a further step, which is that, I think it's legitimate to say something like, okay, Lannister, I think is undervalued by the meta. I think I can get him for $1, and they're actually worth more than that. I mean, like that's a legitimate position for a regent to say. But I think if you're going to do that, you then need to make sure that every other house goes for an appropriate dollar amount. It is a very difficult strategy if you're going to play the $1 house game, because it is now your job to price enforce 7 other houses. And you're very likely to end up with one of those 7 houses by price enforcing. And that may have, I know this is probably not the right detail with Wedge in this event, but accidentally falling into Targaryen at 3 is exactly how you win these kind of events. Like when you price enforce to 75% of your set value for something, you can often get a lot of profit, right? You might accidentally get into the same thing with players. You know, if you have a player at 18 and you're price enforcing them and you get them at 11, that's fantastic, right? You may not have targeted them, but that's just good value right there in terms of how these things go. So like looking at the list here that you and Sandy created, Buzz, like I wouldn't do this where I say don't price enforce on things. And you know, I understand like I really don't want to play these things. But as it is, generally like the lower ones don't have to be price enforced. It's the top ones that do.
Sure.
And if you're gonna go Lanny at $1, then you need to make sure that Greyjoy really goes in the mid 40s.
Yeah.
You know, that these other ones, because otherwise you're creating profit potentials for a lot of other regions, and that's just a really hard road to go.
I mean, realistically, we would have priced enforced if we could, but the goal was to get Greyjoy. Okay, we don't get Greyjoy, we get Night's Watch, we don't get Night's Watch, and all of the time then we're price enforcing, and then end up with a faction. If we don't end up with a faction, we'll keep going Tyrell, Baratheon, probably skip Martell because we were playing with Sandy, and then go Targaryen. So even though we wrote price enforce, this would have been if they nominate Baratheon early, and we really don't want to. Maybe we should have, but the goal was to nominate big factions early, and then we wouldn't be able to price enforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would point out I think you guys actually got a little bit lucky by getting Tyrell at 10. It was starting to get scary. I was concerned of the way things had gone because there weren't, you know, it was your best faction left on the board and you got them at a profit.
Yeah.
And if someone else had been vying for Tyrell, it might have made sense to take them all the way into the 20s just to avoid those other ones.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been ideal, but it might have been the right thing to do at that situation. So I thought you guys got off easy.
So Rabs asks, wouldn't it be more fun to bet just on players and then at the end randomly assign the factions?
I mean, the problem with that is that whoever gets the best faction gets probably the most points. Like, I believe we're going to go into this in a moment, that Greyjoy effectively is worth an extra 12 or 13 wins in this format, whereas I believe Baratheon was worth negative a couple of wins in the format.
Martell was arguably the worst this time.
Yeah.
I mean, this tournament may have been an outlier in terms of Martell's performance, but statistically, Martell was really, really, really bad. That's the technical analysis of Martell in this tournament.
Yeah. Okay. So Scantrell also has a question, but I think we'll tie into that later.
All right, so do we want to kind of look at maybe like house values retroactively?
Yeah. Continue. Yeah.
All right, so how do we make sense of performance, right? And so what I'm going to say here is like, it's really hard. And I don't think we can say anything definitively because we're looking at a single tournament here in this meta. And so it is impossible to accurately separate out player performance from house performance. Okay, we're gonna make some guesses here, but a sample size of 1 means that we can't really do it too definitively. Ideally, for example, if we had 3 different war events running on different continents or something like that, and then we could look at all of those, then in a sense, like all the player information would start to average out across multiple tournaments, and actual house value would start to emerge from that data set.
Yeah, and even then, of course, you still would get a reasonable amount of variance just from, like, for example, matchups. So, you know, if you ran the UK war again with the exact same players on the exact same teams, but just the randomness of which, you know, 2-1 players were matched up against each other in round 3, that sort of thing, then, you know, the butterfly effect could completely change the perceived value of the factions.
Yeah, I mean that would be noise on an individual tournament level.
Mm.
I mean, just let's exaggerate this out. If we could run this tournament 100 times, 1,000
Yeah.
times, we would very definitively be able to say something like Greyjoy as a faction is worth $72.
Mm.
Like you might be able to get to a hard number like that. You know, the higher the the sample size got, because you'd be able to completely take player evaluation out of the equation. As it is, we're looking at one. So what I did here is, as a starting point, is I said, hypothetically, and we know this is not the case, but hypothetically, let's just say that every regent did an equal job of drafting player talent. You know, that if I spent $75 on players, I got $75 worth of wins. That's not what actually happened, but let's do that as a starting point. And then what should we have expected to see? And then what actually happened? And the difference then is going to essentially be profit or loss that we can ascribe to player selection and house. I think most of that probably goes to house. So Buzz, do you want to go back to the spreadsheet and click on the tab that's house evaluation?
Yep.
Okay, so this is me kind of doing that thought exercise here, where we can look at how much each team spent on their house and then how much they actually spent on players. And with Lannister and Targaryen, I mean, one of the amazing things about Targaryen's performance is they actually wasted $6. $6 did not get spent from their draft. So rather than spending 117 dollars on players, they only spent 111. But what you would expect then, column F, expected player wins, is here's how many wins each regent bought from spending this amount on players. So that's what, given a neutral house, that's how much you would expect them to win. And then we can also take out how much did the regent contribute, and then we will determine, okay, what's left over? What can we ascribe to house or player evaluation? And we're mostly going to consider this. Mostly, this is going to be house. And then, not surprisingly, we see the house of Greyjoy as a house contributed the most to what you would expect from spending $81 on players. You got another 14.6 wins there. Number 2 was Night's Watch. Number 3 is Targaryen. The kind of this is starting to sound like, hey, this is the way we would actually, other than the kind of like the surprise of Targaryen, this is how we would actually rank houses in terms of how good they are in the meta in the war format right now, right? There aren't huge surprises here. Lanny's bad. Farah's slightly less bad. And then Martell, again, it's a bit of a surprise here, is really, really, really bad. And in fact, worse than we would even predict for like the lowest performing house here.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Martell is really hard in the war format to do well. There are not very many Martell players, and there are they don't have a really good spread on agendas. They have maybe 1 or 2 good decks, and then usually they have a lot of really bad decks. So people who draft Martell should probably either they should be a top house in the regular meta, or you should have a real good strategy going in. We know that Herdman wasn't gunning for Martell, but was fooled by Martin, and that kind of screwed up his draft probably.
Right. So, right. I think we could say this is an outlier. I don't think we would expect this number to be this, like, again, if we ran this thing 1,000 times, I think, that number for Martell will be less negative. I think it's probably still negative, but it's not this negative. So again, going down to like, so how do we actually convert these into something usable in terms of draft value? And this is probably not completely helpful, but the way to do it is like, okay, if Martell's the worst and you were going to rehold the, auction at the end of the auction, knowing what happened, and Martell's worth $1, then this would justify, a regent maybe spending $70 on Greyjoy, which again is kind of crazy, especially because that would push the entire house budgets that people would spend up to 27.5%. That's almost double what they actually spent on houses. So that's probably unrealistic. So again, I in just trying to get this to a more realistic number, I said, okay, well, let's make this add up to 142, which is what regents actually spent on their houses. And this is starting to look more like what someone should actually pay, other than we had some really negative performances here, right? Like Martell was even worse than what we would expect a $1 house to perform. I mean, like Barrow was a $1 house. It's, Lannister was slightly worse than what we would expect for a $1 house. So we may have, like, we had a really tight competition at the top, like the most competitive Thrones War ever, but the bottom was also like worse, right? Like the normal distribution we'd expect to see from houses here, like the bottom was pretty bad, and it was clustered as a group bad too. But okay, so what your takeaways from this going forward though is that like Greyjoy is still really, really good. Greyjoy didn't win this event, but they came damn close, and you should be spending a lot of money for them. Night's Watch was also, really, really good.
Yeah, they were by far the most spent on factions, and were still making profits.
Right. And so maybe this is an idea again for regents going forward, is like, and I've said this for a number of drafts now, is regents are paying too much for the top players. They're still not paying enough for the top houses. All right. There's still right now there's still consistently been profit by taking the top houses, which is why, I was frustrated when Sandy didn't price enforce Greyjoy to 45, because I think at 45, there's still profit there. Even there was arguably there was profit still in this event here as well. And when it comes to house, like, you don't even necessarily need to have tons of profit in your house. It's nice when you get it, but like price enforcing the top house to the point where you're going to get an average return on it is not the worst thing in the world. I mean, that's a formula for finishing fourth and still putting 4 players in the cut, and maybe winning the thing individually, which is a great experience. I recommend that to regents. Like, especially if you're a regent, wouldn't you want to play the best house available and get deep into the cut? Like, that sounds like a lot of fun to me. Why don't you do that? So going forward, I mean, who knows what the restricted list is going to do, but I would say people are still being shy about bidding up the top houses. There's still profit being made up there, and don't make that mistake.
Yep.
So then this became a starting point for, okay, if we're going to look at player performance then retroactively, which is just kind of like a curiosity. I don't think, for example, we want to look at the wins that a player produced only to determine player value, right? It's not fair to compare a 7-win Baratheon player with a 7-win Greyjoy player, right? That Baratheon player contributed a lot more as a player. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Nodding heads. How much to actually shift that, again, is probably subjective on my part. I took this kind of like house adjustment, and then I just split it in half as kind of a, ballpark, what adjustment we could make. And so, do we want to switch over to player evaluation then?
Sounds
To
good.
kind of,
Let's see, player
yeah,
evaluation.
you can probably you can just click that.
Boom.
All right. So, if we're going to adjust by house, then, kind of tweaking by house, we actually see, is it Franca?
Franca.
From Team Franca. Of Team Bear actually contributing more than the actual tournament winner because of the house that they were playing. And I think, again, this can be helpful in terms of like, what are you going to pay during the auction, kind of knowing what the high end of value that you can get out of a player later on. In this case, the number 1 and 2 players in the game returned $35 and $38 worth of value. So, when talking about James going for 35, it really would have taken him winning the tournament to actually like see profit on that, if you're just going to look at wins. So, the ceiling on what Regents pay for top players probably should be coming down a little bit. They're very bankable, but the ceilings of what people are actually paying right now is probably high, and should get compressed. And you can see we're in like the top 10 players. Only the top 10 players are returning $20+ worth of value.
Yep.
Once we start to adjust based on faction. You want to go to that slide? I kind of did a slide of the top 10 profit players.
Top 10 value players. Yeah.
There we go. So just based on this, these are the players who actually returned the greatest profit in the game based upon, what they contributed. And you can see, like, it's almost impossible for a player in the 20s to contribute a lot of profit, right? Doesn't mean that they can't be part of a winning strategy, but this is not where you're going to have the vast bulk of your profits. And in fact, like right now, in the way these things go, the best chance for you to have profits is in choosing a house. Like that's the story of this one. The profit for grabbing Targaryen is the main where we're going to, put most of the credit for the victory there. There's certainly other areas to assign it, but mostly it's gonna go to house.
Yeah, so choosing Targaryen got wedge a profit of £24, which is more than any player did, and is more than the 2 Targaryen players on that top 10 value slide combined.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we also see that the biggest profit is with the worst players.
Cheapest,
yeah. What people expect to be the worst players. I've always tried to really, when I'm on a team, really work with the low end players, because they can turn profits so easily if you go through the deck with them, if you deck build with them, tune with them, and maybe even like co-op play on Iron Throne. It's proven to be really good at turning profit for us. Yeah.
It might also be the case that we're kind of seeing outliers here, right? Like this is not representative of the 1s and 2s in general, but it's also like part of what we're seeing here is still house value. Like, is it really surprising that the 2 out of the 3 $1 players on this list are Greyjoy players? Like when you buy the best house, it's easier to convert your $1 players into profitable players, right? Like a lot of those house wins you can see probably going in right here in terms of individual players. So like we're probably not even tweaking house enough in determining player value, right? Because I split the difference, this still may be over rewarding the best houses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I obviously we're not going to show it on this screen because we don't want to highlight the specific performance of some of the £1 players, but there were 18 players in the draft who went for £1, And of those 18, we've got 7 of them turning a negative profit and 11 of them turning a profit. And of those 11 who turned a profit, you've got 8 of them that turned a profit of 5 or more, which again suggests that possibly, on the one hand, 8 players out of 96 turning a profit of 5 or more who went cheap isn't completely unreasonable. Because I think there were definitely plenty of very good players, in my opinion, who only went for £1. But it also suggests that possibly not enough credit is being given to the houses in that case.
Right. This list also might be a pretty good example of, like, one of the things I tell regents is to always save $2 for every slot. At the end, there can often be a really big difference between $1 players and the next tier up, and you can generally get that next tier up often for just $2. So try to avoid getting into the situation where you can no longer choose your players at the end of the auction, and you just have to take whoever you get for a buck.
Yeah.
And we see that happen a lot of times, right? And that tends to be a formula for failure. If you're filling out your team with 4 or 5 $1 players, you can get a lot of negative value there.
Yeah. So
I think it depends on. Sorry, Buzz. It depends on the players who are left and what factions you've got. Because I mean, Joe has just made the very good point in the chat that it was kind of insane that, for example, Team Greyjoy was able to get Oliver McDonnell for £1 because this is a player who has made the final of Blackwater playing Greyjoy, and getting him on Team Greyjoy for the minimum possible price is kind of insane.
Do you guys remember how that happened?
I mean, I don't know why the other regents didn't draft him, but he was just still in the pool when it got to the point where Joe only had quids to spend on players, and Joe was like, well, getting Ollie then.
Yeah, he wasn't on our list at all, I believe. But as soon as we also
so you didn't
got
know him, or
I mean,
no.
Yeah, he's London Meta for me, so I knew him.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that Oliver is a jerk?
Ollie is one of the nicest people.
But he's playing Greyjoy now. So as soon as we got Tyrell, we were definitely sorting out a bunch of players. So that could be a good reason for us. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But would Ollie be a £2 steal for any other faction?
This is the other thing I was going to say, is it might come down to faction loyalists being tougher to price enforce, because Ollie, I don't know if I've ever seen him play anything other than Greyjoy. It's not too attractive a proposition for another regent to bid £2 on him and then, have to teach him an entirely new faction to play.
Yeah. This is a bit why I note down their playstyle and some other stats, so that if I know that there is a Greyjoy faction loyalist, I know that most likely this player will do well with any mid-range deck, because you play big guys and you kneel big guys in challenges. Boom, done. So we might have snafu'd and should have gotten Ollie for 2.
You might not have gotten him at 2.
Maybe
forced
not.
Greyjoy to go 3. Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Well, Greyjoy couldn't afford 3 by that point.
Fair enough.
Right.
Yeah, but and then put him on a Tyrell Reigns or something. Yeah,
it's definitely.
That's a good point,
I know Joe had sort of identified there were quite a few players who were very good at Greyjoy, and he just sort of hoped that enough of them would slip to the end of the draft due to them being known as Greyjoy loyalists, that he'd be able to grab a few. And that had mixed success, but Ollie was definitely one of the successes.
Yeah, your point that Greyjoy would not have been able to respond to that is often the case in the final quarter of the draft, is that $2 will get you almost any player at that point. And that's something to be thinking about, is being really quick with that $2 bid, because no one can go 3. And there can be major differences in the quality of the player between a $1, the hypothetical $1 player, and Oliver, maybe like his correct price should have been more like 7 or 8 in terms of average performance, and instead you get him at 2, and in this case they get him at 1, and that's here's where some of your best profit can be.
And we can see you took that approach once you took over the drafting for Sandy. That all of Tyrell's players from player 6 onwards went for 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah, and if we got somebody for 1, it's because we had them substantially higher, and then just nobody topped.
Mm.
We that probably meant if we got a player for 1, that meant that we were certainly willing to go to 3.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to bid 1, have someone else bid 2, and then you'd be like, well, we wanted them at 2, but not at 3.
And towards the end, we nominate at 2, not 1, because we know we want this guy. They can't pay. They can pay 2, but they can't pay 3. So we nominate at 2. And also
2 will be an automatically winning bid, right?
Yeah. Trey had 2 written in the chat box, ready to press enter, and I had a list of the last 5 players we wanted, in the maybe 20. And as soon as someone was nominated, I checked the list. Okay, enter, boom, done, so that we could get the perfect price for them.
Buzz, do you want to talk about how? I mean, in the end, Tyrell finished 4th, but it was real close. I mean, this was a great event with kind of really going down to the wire. In fact, I think we determined that, if had this been a slightly different format and we had counted wins from the play-in round, Night's Watch would have actually won the event.
On a tie.
On a tie, based upon top player there. But we had 4 houses going into the cut with a legitimate chance to win.
Yeah, definitely. So for us, Hano, which we paid 30 for, went 4-3. He missed the cut with 1 game. I overperformed, of course, but I did okay for my price. And it's a card game, so literally anything can happen. If we run this tournament a number of times, Targ might be the worst one suddenly. Probably not, but it could happen. So I don't know. With it being this close, it's hard to assign a definite. Okay, this person did a perfect draft. Wow, let's copy this for next time. Yeah.
Especially when it gets muddier with the regents themselves obviously contributing, because like we just mentioned, if we'd included the play-in round, then Team Night's Watch would have won. But also Team Night's Watch had like 4 or 5, or in one case even 7 extra free wins just from how well the regent did.
Yeah, that's right.
So I mean, in the player evaluation thing, we had Costas as being worth almost 35 pounds, which means that the team that Costas was on effectively had a £155 budget, whereas, to take a middling example so that I don't offend anyone, Stark had a £131 budget because Rebecca was worth £11, as it turns out.
Yeah.
So
Sandy was the second best performing regent with 5.
Yeah.
So great. So Night's Watch had an additional 4 wins. So that's the reason Night's Watch was there at the end, was the performance of a single regent. And being a good player as a regent is a huge advantage, obviously. But it's also the case that if you're going to be a regent, pairing yourself with a top house makes a lot of sense, right? You're maximizing your own individual chances as well, and that probably should go a little bit into the thinking of what houses go for, right? If you're the regent, are you really going to go deep into the cut playing Lanny in the current meta?
And if your skills as a regent are in areas other than how many wins you're going to personally contribute to the team, does that mean that maybe you only care about price enforcing the top factions and then only getting one of the more middling ones? Because you know that you're not going to be able to execute on the potential of the faction anyway. So you're giving some money away in that regard.
Well, the only
Or-
reason I disagree with that is just because, like I said, I still think that regents aren't paying enough for the top
Oh,
factions.
yeah,
So
no,
if
I
I'm
agree with
if
that.
I'm a regent, which would be an extremely bad idea at a coming event because I'm not a very good player, I would still be pushing really hard on a top faction because I feel like there's still plenty of profit to be made there, and there may be even something to like I need to deny Greyjoy to other people. Even I think it's indicative. Like Targ won today. And I think they did that without actually getting any additional wins in the cut. Like I
Yeah.
think they had some play-in wins, but their actual win total, as far as it counted, did not improve at all, which is an indication that Targ is still not a tip-top faction on an individual level. I know, again, small sample size, but we didn't. And like when we had CT take Targ to a final in an event, but Targ probably isn't tier 1, but they're not bottom tier either. And there was plenty of profit there in what Wedge did this time. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we're going to break down the Tyrell success at 4th place, but in the running, you probably had about, $8 to $10 worth of profit on the house starting out. And then you probably had another, 10 or $20 worth of profit in player selection, and a lot of that would have been at the bottom. And I'm not, getting profit at the bottom of the draft is one of the places where I think we talked about where you have your best profit potential. So, I mean, it was our strategy going in to spend $2 on those bottom players, but this should be something that every regent should be thinking about, especially during the auction, is don't put yourself in a position where you have to bid $1 for your remaining slots. Like that's clearly a tactical mistake in these things. Do we want to real quick just look at our own projections and how we were wrong about Targaryen going into this, Buzz?
Yep. We have
Sounds like
Wamma's predictions now.
Oh, what? Oh, that bothers me.
Hmm.
That N on Baratheon just bothers me.
Yeah.
Baratheon when, yeah. I mean, there's definitely some areas where I was wrong. Let's put it that way. Let's focus on the positives. Let's focus on Greyjoy almost being spot on.
Mm-hmm. And you were far more right about Targaryen than I was. I was far more wrong about Targaryen, and I like to ascribe that to Buzz and Sandy, but I got to take responsibility for my own numbers here. So yeah, Stark kind of underperformed, right? Did Stark? Is this surprising to you? What do you make out of what happened with Stark?
It's interesting because obviously it's worth saying, I guess, at this point where my predictions came from. So basically, from just after the UK Grand Championships, which was the start of June, it's when we got the restricted list that this tournament was being contested under. From then up until the point of the draft, I pulled all the data from Jousting Pavilion of how much is Faction X beating Faction Y, figured out the win ratios for each of those matchups, and then said, okay, well, if that matchup's happening 12 times and, Targaryen's beating Night's Watch 62% of the time, for example, how many wins are we expecting Targaryen to get from that round of matches? And then how much are we expecting them to get from their round of matches against Stark, from against Greyjoy, and so on? And then from that, figuring out how many wins you'd expect each faction to get. And then the numbers after that were then filtered by the players that were drafted to each faction. What are their win rates with the factions in question? Which was very unscientific insofar as there was a ridiculous amount of noise with some of those choices. You had players who only played Tyrell, say, in a single tournament and won every game or lost every game. And so the formula was recording 12 and 0 wins for them respectively, which was, sorry, not 12 and 0, 7 and 0, which realistically was never going to happen, but is what the numbers were showing. But from that, you're able to say, okay, these 12 players are expected to get this many wins each with this faction, and this faction is expected to sort of nudge the proportions by this much. Based on that, how many wins total is the faction going to get, and how many players are going to get in the cup? So there we've got the number of wins that I predicted for each team to get after Swiss, and the number in the cup in brackets. But the problem with that, obviously, first of all, as I said, the moment it got to player evaluation, it got very sketchy in terms of how accurate it was ever realistically going to be. And also because it was evaluating the meta from a 2-month period that had, I think in that period of time, we'd had the Baratheon box and 2 chapter packs had been released. And so the meta shifted ultimately. So, that Grand Championship, coming out of that Grand Championship, that's where I won with Stark, where Ryan made the top 4 with Stark. But then if you look at, say, Blackwater Bay that came, a month and a half later on, Stark wasn't really anywhere to be seen in the cup, but there was still that period of time beforehand where Stark had been a clear force in the meta. And so, to an extent, in the name of trying to get more data to prevent there being too much noise, I feel like some of the data that generated those predictions was out of date. Principally, I think Stark fell off a little bit in that time. Lannister rose during that time, albeit not significantly. Based off the numbers, apparently Tyrell rose during that time. But I think that's probably the biggest source of the disparities, is in the valuations placed on factions being incorrect.
Yeah. So Stark underperformed at Thrones War Prime this year, and now again. And both of those times, that in the draft, they had the last 5 slots, they had $5 for. Which means that they didn't choose any of their players in the last 5. I imagine Stark would not underperform this much if they went with our approach of assigning $2 per player at the end.
It's interesting you say that, because obviously after the Thrones War Prime draft, I remember there being a Second Sons episode in which you and Trey presented your predictions and had Stark being last by quite a distance. Whereas we'll get onto them in a moment, Trey's predictions this time had Stark finishing 4th, despite that draft strategy.
Sure.
So I think there's definitely an element to, you don't necessarily want to be left with having to get the cheapest players forced upon you. But I think it can be a winning strategy as long as the rest of your draft goes well. It's just that in this case, Stark were overvalued in terms of what they were actually worth.
Yeah, I'm just sad that we haven't seen recently because I really believe in Stark. Sandy just didn't want Stark in this format because of the deck building restrictions favoring them to an extent, similarly to Tyrell and Night's Watch.
You'd think, right? I mean, separating out the $1 thing, it just does feel to me anecdotally, completely unscientifically, like Stark has been underperforming in the war format for a while now.
One thing about that though is that last year at Thrones Prime, Stark was legitimately really bad.
Mm-hmm.
This last year, they have been really good, and we haven't had a Thrones War draft where I feel, okay, this is a decent draft.
Well, take a look at Thronstoberfest, because I think Stark went for a pretty low amount.
Yeah,
like around 12 or something like that in this one. So like Stark could have a really good chance.
Maybe we don't know the Thronstoberfest is weird because we don't know the restricted list, and we know that it will be in effect basically. And
the
people
rumor is tomorrow, right?
Yeah, and we expect Stark to be hit, so people didn't bid them up very much at all. Yeah, but I would have liked to play Stark at both the recent war events I've been at, and I am also sad that we haven't seen a draft that I like, maybe the regions like their drafts, from Stark, because I imagine they could have done a lot better. Yeah.
Cool. You want to switch to my predictions real quick, and then we'll
go
to takeaways?
Sure.
Again, this was kind of, again, like both of us had Stark doing better than they actually did. And all this was taking Buzz and Sandy's player evaluations, and then, that has a certain wins associated with the ranking, adding them up, and then adding up how much we thought each house would contribute. And that's how we got to these numbers. So, too much for Stark and obviously not enough for Targaryen, but shouldn't be surprising considering that we had them at $6, which is, ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, most of the other ones are spot on, right?
Yeah, I got 3 out of the 4. Top 4 look pretty good.
Yeah. Even Stark doesn't look too terrible. Like 6 wins is a reasonably large disparity, but I think the only ones that I'd say were wrong were Martell and Targaryen, which isn't too surprising in that those are the 2 factions that respectively under and overperformed on everyone's expectations.
Yeah.
That's right. Cool. Do we want to go to like maybe takeaways of just like, some kind of few things that I would say to regents going forward on this? So I think I already said, regents as a whole are not paying enough for top houses yet. I still believe that. We'll see after the restricted list. We should see like a certain amount of compression in the value of the houses, but I think like we still haven't gotten to what people should actually be paying for house. I mean, I think paying something like 20 to 25% of the total budget would be completely reasonable from regents, but it does matter how other people bid. So you don't necessarily want to be a complete outlier in terms of how you bid compared to other people. But there's still profit potential at the top. I think that's the real story behind, I guess, what you're calling, War Prime now was, like you guys got Targaryen for 41, something like that. And it could easily have been worth 60 or 70 in actuality. So there was a lot of profit there before you even got into like player profit. So there's a lot of ground to be made up with that. And related to that is, I would say to regents and shake them, please, because I hear this a lot. I think we had like 3 different regents, according to James, were saying, I'm fine with Lanny at $1. I would say if you find yourself saying something like this going into the auction, you're until you prove me wrong, this is a formula for disaster. Because regents aren't paying enough for the top houses, going cheap, knowing you want to go cheap, and thinking you're going to make up for it by buying a lot of quality as players, like we just haven't seen that. Maybe it happened in the first year of Thrones War, but like that's a whole different game now. Abandon the strategy, especially because it's hard. If you're going to go like Lanny or Barra at $1, what it really means is like you have to have fantastic numbers on every other house, like have a really good idea of what they're going to go for, and then price enforce them. It also means that you're not going to be able to build your team around your house unless you're forecasting it really early on, that like I'm getting all of these Lannister players early on, and like that may not work out. So just don't do that. We haven't seen that work yet. In fact, we've seen it be disastrous a number of times. So, stop doing it.
I mean, obviously in this case, one of the 3 regents who did that did win the draft, but they got what turned out to be the good faction of the 3 dregs that were available at the end.
Yeah.
And the other 2 factions in that scenario finished 5th and 6th, only separated by final player position.
Yeah. The fault here is on Martin and Matt, right? They handed Targaryen on a silver platter to Wedge. Like, here you go. Go win the draft.
Martin and Josh, do you mean?
Martin and Josh. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I might be remembering the draft wrong, but I believe at that point they couldn't price enforce it.
Yeah. Oh, maybe.
Right. Well, this is an example
would they have? They said that they wouldn't have.
I can't speak to their intentions. Okay. It's quite possible their intentions were also wrong.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't speak to their intentions either. What the Targaryen bid of 3 actually represents, though, is price enforcing. Like, by price enforcing, you actually have a tremendous amount of profit potential. If you're price enforcing a house to 70, especially the higher ones, to 75% of what you think their perceived value is, and you get it, you just locked in a ton of profit. Targaryen, by not going Lanny for $1 or whatever, ended up getting a tremendous amount of value by pricing forcing, even if that was accidental or even anecdotal about the way the draft went. That's actually very good strategy, and it worked out very well for that team.
Yeah.
Yeah, chat's saying that at that point Martin had approximately £7 left and Josh had 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Martin price enforced Targaryen up to 3, but not beyond. And Josh wasn't in a position to price enforce.
Yeah, and I wouldn't blame these 2 regents necessarily individually. I mean, Targaryen's price going that low is, in a sense, kind of a collective failure, and it's also an outlier.
Mm-hmm.
This didn't happen in the one before, and it didn't happen in the one after. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little freakish.
Yeah, we didn't price enforce Greyjoy. Sandy actually didn't price enforce Greyjoy to where we wanted it to be, and so it went cheaper and set the mark kind of. If Greyjoy went for more, then the second one might have gone for more and trickling down as well.
Yeah, there should kind of be a natural order where like the houses kind of do go in the order in which they're ranked collectively by the group.
Yeah,
like that probably is the way it should go, even in an ideal strategy kind of way.
I think there's also an element with the price enforcing is that you need to have a very good idea of what the faction is actually worth before you start price enforcing, because Matt price enforced Martell. He just did it too aggressively and ended up overpaying for them. And if, say, Martin had ended up getting Martell for 17, I imagine Matt would have been price enforcing Tyrell and Targaryen a lot more aggressively than they were enforced.
Yeah,
That's what happened with Martell. That was an attempt to price enforce.
Yes, for sure.
So, do you want to go back to your sheet and see what you and Sandy had for Martell?
It was low.
I believe it was
8.
7 and don't enforce, is from what I remember.
Right, and see, this is why this is why this is a good game, is that you can have these huge discrepancies
7,
in what different regents think about the different factions, right? Because I have a hard time seeing 18 as price enforcing our Martell, but this just shows that we had a huge discrepancy in terms of perceptions about that house. For some reason, Martell was way up here and Targaryen was way down here. That seems wrong, but that was the circumstance.
Yeah, the idea is that Martin, who fooled Matt into getting Martell, is a Martell loyalist, and people were assuming he would pay a lot of money to get it, and then suddenly stop bidding.
So Martin was there at 17, is that right?
Yeah, and then Matt got it for 18.
Right, but this is why, again, you have your numbers, and then you price enforce to a certain point. Like, right, 18 seems pretty crazy. Like, I would never recommend to regents price enforcing where you find yourself saying, "Oh, this person really loves this. I can bid them up." Like, you never make a bid you're not comfortable winning.
Yeah.
And I think that's what like they may have gotten a little too clever in thinking they knew Martin and ended up with this result.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Which again is like maybe why you want to start with the better houses. I think it's totally legitimate to like identify a top house, go after it aggressively early on, especially if it fits your play style, especially because there's huge advantages to building your team around a house when you know your house early, right? I mean, you guys have looked at your own lists, and like one of the things where there's profit potential is ultimately players are not going to simply be like, this player is worth $12. It's no, this player would probably be worth $17 as a Greyjoy player, but it's going to be worth $9 as a Barra player or something like that. You can have huge discrepancies in player value just based upon what team they end up. That isn't even like this house is better than this. It can just be the type of player they are matching up with the play style of the house. And so the earlier you lock in your house, the more likely you are to have an Oliver situation where you can get a Greyjoy player for $1 that everybody else is going to look at and say, well, I don't see any evidence that this person knows how to play anything other than Greyjoy.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's all I got. Do we have any other questions from chat?
There was that question from Scantrell from a while ago. Do y'all have any thoughts on alternate rules or processes for drafting a faction? Do you think the current system works fine? So presumably this is referring to the general notion of having, in this case, 96 things up for auction and then having a snake auction in which people draft them. If that's not what you meant, Scantrell, then I apologize and clarify below, please.
No, I think it's great. But I do think it requires regents to be fairly well prepared, in order to, especially when it comes to the house aspect. Regents have to be prepared and they have to be competitive. Like the auction mechanic for balancing out the houses is a critical mechanism at the core of this format. I think it's a really great one, but it does require a certain amount of preparation on the behalf of regents, and I think that's what regents, in a sense, owe the player pool. When you sign up to be a regent, I think you should be saying, I am willing to commit hours of my time to prepare for this, because I'm not just talking about my own experience here. I'm taking a certain amount of responsibility for all the players I'm going to draft as well, and that I'm going to work hard to make their experience as good as possible by fielding the most competitive team and effort that I can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then again, I'm going to throw out we're going to make kind of a generic pre-draft spreadsheet available to any regent that wants it. We can even publicize it. I would like to get additional math help from people that are actually good at this kind of thing for building a better distribution of wins to make this more accurate going forward. And that maybe goes to the whole thing of that way maybe these events can be more competitive, because I think like that's just kind of like an inherent truth here. Is like the more competitive these events are, the more fun it will be for everyone.
I can definitely attest to the drama in the cut where, going into the top 16, there were still 4 different factions that could win. Going into the top 8, there were still 3 different factions that could win. Going into the top 4, there were still 2 different factions that could win. It was in a good way, a very tense environment to be in.
Yeah.
And it added to the fun of it a lot to have it be remaining competitive going on that long. If Targaryen had 2 more wins in the Swiss than they did, then basically the entire cut would have been just a write-off, and basically people focusing on the individual side of it, because there's no way anyone would catch them.
Yeah. So we had players that weren't in the cut in Team Tyrell coming up and telling us, oh guys, we can still win, guys. And we're really invested in all of our wins, which is really fun.
Yeah. I know Jack Machin for Targ was saying how he couldn't believe he cared this much about any second edition game, whether he was in it or not.
Yeah.
And that was for a game that didn't even feature any Targaryen players, because it was hoping that people from Greyjoy and Night's Watch were getting knocked out to try and confirm Targaryen's victory.
Yeah.
It's the power of war.
I think it's a fantastic format. And I think it's the best community building events out there. You get to know a lot of different people from all over the world. These events bring people together and, help build community. I think we've seen they continue to be really well attended, and like they're kind of the most successful events in the community.
Yeah.
And if you do one, you want to do more. You know?
Yeah, I did one. I came back the year after, and then I did UK War. I've gone to every single one I could, and it's basically the only kind of tournament I attend nowadays. So, yeah.
Yeah, maybe with that in mind, I think it would make sense to maybe take a little bit of the weight off of individual organizers, like to maybe solidify some of these rules that are kind of like right now there's some differences in different rules between different events, and it might make sense to just codify all of those, you know. And like personally, I think that, you know, play-in wins should count, you know,
Yeah.
like that. That also like makes it, that means it's more likely to kind of go deeper into deciding who wins. I think that should always be the case. I think we should have a uniform policy for what do we do about what happens when players drop between the time that they are drafted in the auction and you get to the event. You know, obviously organizers need to have a little bit of flexibility about that, but when we've seen some controversy, it often comes out of the how do you replace people. Like I think originally we were looking at like when people don't show up, you had a whole system for buys and not rewarding buys as opposed to every buy just being a win. These are kind of tough questions, but we probably should just have a uniform policy to, again, like take it away from throwing something on an organizer where they suddenly have to kind of like come up with a solution the day before an event and do the best they can, and maybe get it wrong, or people just be unhappy with what somebody decides, as opposed for there to be a stated policy that you always then just stick with.
Yeah, we almost had a situation like that at UK War, where one of the Baratheon players was getting his stomach pumped overnight. Missed the first round, had a loss for that, but was there to play from round 2 onwards.
Didn't do too well, though.
No, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we don't recommend the drinking to an unhealthy degree approach. Different people have their limits at different points. And, you know, I think if we're to send out one message from this entire stream, it would be drink responsibly.
Friday night.
Yeah.
Saturday night.
Yeah.
Depends if you're in the cut or not. You can drink irresponsibly if you're not in the cut.
True.
But you're
Well,
also...
thanks for putting this together,
Yeah.
Buzz.
Cool. All right. We will try and contact people organizing these kind of things so that going forward we maybe have even cooler events. See you around.